Everyone working in a critical role must get the PPE that they need.
We've signed contracts for over 2 billion items of PPE, including face masks, visors, gowns and aprons.
We've got to do more to get the PPE that people need to the front line.
A time most of us want to forget. But if you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it. A mantra that has run through these COVID inquiry proceedings. This is Module 5, procurement, getting the medical equipment during the pandemic. What began as a dire need for PPE became a flawed and chaotic scramble that left healthcare staff underprotected.
The UK entered the pandemic with inadequate and untested plans to increase its emergency procurement and distribution operations rapidly, and the bodies responsible were caught off guard.
One of the stark statistics in the report is the amount of money spent by the UK government and devolved administrations on PPE. Out of 14.9 billion spent, 2/3 of it, 10 billion, was identified as wasted. A conclusion was made that better planning would have been fairer and faster. Experts have told this programme that there's little chance of recovering the money.
My mother's care workers had one thin medical mask per 8-hour shift.
Naomi Fallop's mother, Christina, died of COVID-19 in January 2021.
So they were going from frail elderly person to frail elderly person wearing a thin blue medical mask.
And who do you blame for this?
I blame the then government for their failure to prepare for a pandemic and for setting up this VIP lane that was catastrophic.
In England, favourable treatment was given to suppliers with connections to the government, the so-called VIP lane, a system found to be misguided and illegal. No other country in the world did this.
The high priority lane embedded unfairness in the UK government's emergency procurement, where billions of pounds were at stake. It should not have been set up, and it should not be repeated.
Despite this, she found no evidence of cronyism or corruption.
Although she said that, there is evidence in the report to the contrary. So, for example, there's a company called Mellor that was a fashion company and the owner of which knew Michael Gove. And through that, they got a contract for PPE. And if that isn't cronyism, I don't know what is.
There was no finding of cronyism or corruption by Mellor Designs from the chair of the inquiry, but bereaved families still feel let down. The government says they'll consider the recommendations made in this report, but this is only the halfway point in the inquiry, with more painful lessons still to be learnt.
Earlier, I spoke to Michael Gove, who was the lead minister in the cabinet for much of the pandemic. Michael Gove, last year you apologised in another phase of the inquiry that talked about the toxic and chaotic culture of Downing Street. Do you think a waste of £10 billion deserves another apology?
Well, I certainly think it's the case that mistakes were made in the procurement of PPE, but it's important to stress that these were honest errors. It was the case that across the Western world at that time, countries were found to be ill-prepared for the nature of the pandemic. And in almost every other European nation, like the UK, we simply didn't have enough PPE. It is the case that in our urgency and desire to make sure that people at the front line got the equipment that they needed, that there was slack over-ordering, and the cost of that was greater than it should have been. But Heather Hallett recognised the circumstances under which the government were operating, and appropriate lessons, I think, have been learned.
I mean, you say honest errors. You know, people might conclude, honest, perhaps, or intentional, incompetence. That you ended up spending more on VIP lane PPE than non-VIP lane, and you wasted 2/3 of the money that was spent on PPE to the tune of £10 billion.
It is not the case that VIP lane PPE was more expensive than PPE which was sourced elsewhere. Some items in the VIP lane were cheaper than items that were sourced elsewhere, some more expensive. All of this in a context when every country in the world was chasing after this material, desperate to get it.
Can I quote Dame
And yes,
Heather?
we did overorder.
The evidence suggests that high priority lane contracts were more expensive.
Well, in that respect, the report is wrong. And if one looks both at the evidence that was given by Gareth Rhys-Williams and also at the evidence that was given by Claire Gibbs to the inquiry, in both cases that evidence clearly shows that while some items were more expensive in the VIP lane, other items were cheaper. And it's important to stress that. It's also important to stress that the VIP lane was set up by officials, manned by officials, and within the inquiry report, Heather Hallett states clearly there is no evidence of corruption or criminality or cronyism on the part of ministers or officials.
That's true,
now,
but she does say
point,
it offended the principles of fairness and that although there was no evidence of cronyism, the operation created an unfairness within the government's emergency procurement. The system was inherently biased towards those with connections to the UK government.
I don't believe that actually the evidence justifies that. The high priority lane was dealing with those offers that came from, in an overwhelming number of cases, the most credible sources. And the evidence presented to the inquiry showed that wherever any recommendation came from, a rigorous process was followed in order to ensure that the offers that were made came from reputable sources who were capable of providing PPE. I think the biggest error overall, which you quite rightly pointed to at the beginning of the interview, was over-ordering. But as I think Heather Hallett also points out, if one had to choose between over-ordering and under-ordering, over-ordering, while an error, and one which quite rightly the government should be held to account for, was the lesser of the two sins.
Well, I mean, the report doesn't say that over-ordering was the only cause of £10 billion, and you've now disagreed with two matters in the report.
Yes.
There are COVID families, as you know, who also reject a finding of the report, which was that there wasn't cronyism, and they believe that there was cronyism. They go further and say corruption. If you're entitled to disagree with the report,
well,
so are they.
Of course they are, but I'd be fascinated, obviously, to see what the evidence is. It's understandable that people who suffered hugely and whose grief commands our attention and deserves our sympathy should have their say. Their voices are important. But it is also the case that we should stick to the facts.
But you are rejecting the facts in the report, aren't you? I mean, the report says the evidence suggests the high priority lane contracts were more expensive, and it says that there was an unfairness and an inherent bias, and you've rejected those as facts. So, I mean, people can pick and choose, can't they?
But I'm not doing so on the basis of subjective opinion, which of course everyone is entitled to. I'm doing so on the basis of objective facts and evidence that was shared with the inquiry by the government's own internal audit team, and also the evidence which was sworn under oath by the individual who was in charge of government procurement overall. No one has been able to gainsay that evidence, that factual evidence. So I think an erroneous, though understandable conclusion was drawn. And I think that those who are attempting to generate outrage, I exempt the COVID families from this, of course, but those who are attempting to generate outrage did so for transparently political purposes. And it also gets in the way of a proper focus, which you are right to insist on the mistakes that were made, both in preparation for a pandemic like this and in over-ordering during it. These are big mistakes. I am happy to take responsibility for those.
I mean, the trouble is, does it pass the sniff test? And that's what a lot of people are struggling with, because, you know, they look at examples such as your personal friend, David Mellor, who ended up receiving contracts worth £164 million. And they detail in the report how officials made it clear to their colleagues that, you know, this man was it was a high-profile VIP request, and it was observed that he had Michael Gove's ear, and that in itself can corrupt the decision-making.
Well, it's perfectly clear, actually, that it was quite the opposite. I was, as all ministers were, transparent about any connections in order to make it clear to people, not to hide, not to make covert, but to be totally transparent about that. But no minister was responsible for any procurement decision.
But the question is, if an official knows that a man is your friend and that he has your ear, is that going to influence the decision-making? The creation of this VIP lane, which was unique to the United Kingdom, set up a structure which made these unfair decisions part of the process.
Well, they weren't unfair decisions.
Well, she says they were.
It's quite wrong to think, it's quite wrong to think that an official would actively favour a bidder on the basis that they were the acquaintance, friend or contact of a minister. That is not how the British civil service operates.
Yeah, I mean, there are a wide range of lessons to be learned for future governments. But one of the key points that she is making is that the VIP lane was a mistake. It was unique to Britain and it caused perhaps unintended biases, but they were there. It was inherently biased and she says it cost more. Do you accept it was a mistake now to set up the VIP lane?
No. So the first thing is, simply because something is unique to Britain doesn't mean that it's bad. The NHS is unique to Britain. The second thing is that other countries had their own ways of triaging offers. While they didn't have exactly the same method that we did, there is no evidence at all that our approach led to corruption, cronyism or criminality. None. Now, related to that, of course, there are people who can say, with the benefit of hindsight, that there might be better methods of procurement. Let's learn those lessons. But let's also bear in mind that what we were seeking to do at the time was, when there was a global scarcity of supply, make sure that we could prioritise offers from whatever source, from individuals who had credible links with manufacturers who could provide people on the front line with the equipment that they needed.
Michael Gove, thank you very much.
Thank you.